Have you ever caught yourself staring blankly at your phone without remembering how you got there? Or noticed that you've been tapping your pen rhythmically for the past 5 minutes without any conscious intention? Most of our daily behavior operates on autopilot, orchestrated by psychological mechanisms we don't fully understand. We live our entire lives executing complex behaviors, emotional responses, and social rituals without ever questioning the underlying reasons. Our brains are constantly working behind the scenes, pulling the strings of consciousness, and we're blissfully unaware of the psychological forces that drive our actions. The human brain is perhaps the most sophisticated decision-making apparatus ever to evolve. Yet paradoxically, most of what it does remains hidden from our conscious awareness. Scientists estimate that our conscious mind processes roughly 40 bits of information per second, while our unconscious mind processes millions. We're operating at perhaps 5 conscious capacity, with the remaining 95 of our mental machinery handling the heavy lifting in the background. This fundamental disconnect between what we think controls our behavior and what actually does is both fascinating and unsettling. Throughout this exploration, we'll examine 25 common psychological phenomena that influence your behavior in ways you've likely never considered. These aren't exotic or rare behaviors, they're the mundane, everyday actions that fill your waking hours. They're the reason you can't help but yawn when someone else yawns, why you unconsciously adjust your speech patterns when speaking to authority figures, or why you feel compelled to return borrowed items even when no one would notice. Understanding these hidden drivers of behavior offers profound insights into what makes you human and fundamentally changes how you relate to your own mind. 1. Mirror neurons and why you unconsciously mimic others. When you watch someone throw a ball, specific neurons in your brain fire as if you were throwing the ball yourself. This isn't metaphorical. Your brain literally simulates the action. Mirror neurons were discovered in the 1990s by Italian neuroscientist Giacomo Rizzolatti and have since revolutionized our understanding of empathy, learning, and social behavior. Mirror neurons explain why you unconsciously mimic the mannerisms of people you're with. When you sit across from someone, you naturally begin to mirror their posture, their hand gestures, and even their facial expressions. This happens completely outside your awareness. If someone leans forward, you lean forward. If they cross their legs, your legs often follow suit within minutes. This automatic mimicry serves a deep evolutionary purpose. It facilitates social bonding and creates a sense of rapport and connection. The phenomenon extends beyond just physical mimicry. Your mirror neuron system also allows you to mirror emotional states. When you see someone smile, mirror neurons related to smiling activate in your brain. When you observe someone in pain, pain-related neurons fire. This is why watching someone break their leg can make us wince involuntarily. Our brains are experiencing a diluted version of their pain. This neural mechanism forms the biological basis of empathy and social understanding. One of the most powerful demonstrations of mirror neuron activity occurs in conversations. Without conscious effort, people in dialogue begin to synchronize not just their words, but their breathing patterns and vocal intonations. If you speak quickly, the person listening will unconsciously speed up their own thought processes and eventual speech patterns. This synchronization is one reason why conversations with certain people feel effortless and natural, while others feel awkward and forced. When mirror neuron activation is strong, social interaction flows smoothly. When it's weak or misaligned, communication becomes strained. The mirror neuron system also explains why laughter is so contagious. Watching someone laugh activates your motor cortex in the same regions that would activate if you were laughing. This is why laugh tracks on television actually do increase viewers' likelihood of finding content funny. The audio triggers mirror neuron activation without you realizing it. Television producers have understood mirror neuron principles for decades without the science having formal names. Interestingly, Research on mirror neurons in psychopaths and individuals with autism spectrum disorder reveals fascinating variations. Psychopaths appear to have reduced mirror neuron activation, which may explain their characteristic lack of empathy and emotional responsiveness. Meanwhile, some research suggests that autism involves differences in mirror neuron functioning, though the relationship is complex and not fully understood. These variations highlight how crucial these automatic neural systems are to normal social and emotional functioning. 2. The bystander effect. Why you do less when others are around. Imagine a person collapses on a crowded subway platform. Studies consistently show that in this scenario, you're less likely to help than if the same person collapsed and you were alone with them. This counterintuitive phenomenon is called the bystander effect, and it has shaped our understanding of helping behavior and social responsibility for decades. The bystander effect occurs because of a psychological process called diffusion of responsibility. When multiple people are present during an emergency, the responsibility to help feels dispersed among the group rather than concentrated on any individual. Your brain unconsciously calculates that someone else is probably already calling 911, that others are better positioned to help, or that someone with more expertise will intervene. This mental calculation happens automatically, outside conscious awareness, and results in a reduced sense of personal obligation. The first systematic study of this phenomenon came after a tragic incident in 1964, when Kitty Genovese was murdered outside her apartment building in Queens, New York. Reports at the time suggested that 38 witnesses heard her screams and did nothing. This incident prompted psychologists John Darley and Bibb Latané to investigate why bystanders fail to help. Their research revealed that the presence of others fundamentally alters our perception of responsibility and our likelihood of action. What's particularly insidious about the bystander effect is that it operates automatically. You're not consciously thinking about diffusing responsibility or calculating the probability that someone else will help. These processes happen in the background of your mind through neural circuits that evolved long before modern emergencies existed. Your brain is defaulting to ancient evolutionary logic in a modern environment, where that logic often produces harmful outcomes. The bystander effect extends beyond emergencies. In workplace environments, when someone makes an offensive comment in a group setting, the likelihood that anyone will challenge them decreases with group size. In online spaces, thousands of people witness harassment or abuse, yet fewer intervene than would in a smaller group. The cognitive mechanism remains the same, regardless of the specific context. More people equals diluted individual responsibility. Psychological research has identified several moderating factors. The effect is reduced when responsibility is explicitly assigned to an individual. If you point directly at one person and say, "You call 911," that person is far more likely to do so than if the general crowd is told to call emergency services. The effect is also reduced when the situation is unambiguous. If it's crystal clear that an emergency is occurring, people are more likely to help regardless of group size. But in ambiguous situations, someone lying on the ground who might be sleeping, someone shouting who might be playing around the presence of others, dramatically increases uncertainty and decreases helping behavior. 3. Cognitive biases. Why your brain lies to you. Your brain doesn't perceive reality. It constructs a version of reality based on filtered, distorted, and interpreted sensory information. This constructed reality is shaped by cognitive biases, systematic patterns of thinking that deviate from rational judgment and accurate perception. There are literally hundreds of documented cognitive biases, each one a way your brain unconsciously distorts reality. One of the most fundamental is confirmation bias. Your brain actively searches for information that confirms what you already believe, while dismissing or reinterpreting contradictory information. If you believe that a particular brand of product is superior, You'll unconsciously notice and remember instances where it performed well while forgetting times it failed. If you believe someone is annoying, you'll interpret their behavior through a lens that confirms this perception. The same joke that would seem funny from someone you like will seem obnoxious from someone you've already categorized negatively. Confirmation bias is so powerful that it can completely override objective evidence. Studies show that providing people with factual corrections to their misconceptions often backfires, making them cling more tightly to their original incorrect beliefs. This happens because your brain perceives the correction as a threat to your existing worldview, triggering defensive mechanisms that strengthen rather than weaken the original belief. Another major bias is anchoring bias. When you first encounter a number in a conversation or context, that number unconsciously becomes a reference point that shapes your subsequent judgments, even when the number is completely arbitrary. If someone asks, "Do you think the average snowfall in December is less than 100 inches?" and you answer, you've been anchored to the number 100, which will unconsciously influence your subsequent estimates. Salespeople exploit anchoring bias by presenting a high initial price once that anchor is established. Lower prices feel like deals even when they're still expensive. The availability heuristic causes you to overestimate the likelihood of events that are easy to remember. If you've recently heard about plane crashes, you'll unconsciously think plane travel is more dangerous than it actually is, even though statistically you're far more likely to die in a car accident. Tragic deaths are memorable and emotionally impactful, so your brain treats them as more common than they are. News media exploits this heuristic by disproportionately covering rare dramatic events, causing the public to have wildly distorted perceptions of risk. The Dunning-Kruger effect causes people with low ability in an area to dramatically overestimate their competence. People who know very little about a subject feel the most confident discussing it because they lack the knowledge to recognize the extent of their ignorance. Someone who has just read one book on a complex subject feels they understand it well enough to debate experts. Meanwhile, true experts often suffer from imposter syndrome, underestimating their abilities because they're acutely aware of how much they still don't know. The gap between confidence and actual competence is largest precisely when someone has the least knowledge. The fundamental attribution error causes you to overattribute others' behavior to their personality while underestimating situational factors. If someone cuts you off in traffic, you immediately think, "What a terrible driver," rather than considering that they might have just received an emergency phone call and are rushing to the hospital. But if you cut someone off, you immediately blame the situation, "I was distracted," or "the sun was in my eyes." This asymmetry in attribution happens automatically and unconsciously, biasing how you judge others and creating false impressions of their character. Hindsight bias makes past events feel more predictable than they actually were. After an event occurs, you unconsciously revise your memory of how surprised you were, convincing yourself that "I knew this would happen." This makes you feel like you understand the world better than you actually do and can lead to overconfidence in your ability to predict future events. After a stock market crash, people insist they saw it coming. After an election result surprises, people claim they predicted it. But before these events occurred, people's actual predictions were far more uncertain. 4. The backfire effect. Why conflicting information strengthens your beliefs. One of the most frustrating aspects of human psychology is that presenting someone with factual evidence that contradicts their beliefs often makes them believe the false information even more strongly. This counterintuitive phenomenon, called the backfire effect, occurs through several psychological mechanisms that operate unconsciously. When you encounter information that contradicts your worldview, your brain perceives it as a threat. This triggers defensive mechanisms designed to protect your identity and your sense of understanding the world. Rather than accepting the contradictory information, Your brain mobilizes resources to defend the original belief. You unconsciously search for reasons why the contradictory information might be wrong, why the source might be unreliable, or why the evidence might have been misinterpreted. This defensive response occurs regardless of how factual the contradictory information is. In studies, researchers presented participants with misinformation, then provided factual corrections. The participants who received corrections not only failed to update their beliefs, but actually became more confident in the original misinformation. The brain treated the correction as a hostile challenge and mobilized defenses accordingly. The backfire effect is intensified when the contradictory information comes from a source you already distrust, or when accepting it would require too much revision of your existing belief system. For example, if your political identity is deeply connected to believing something is true, evidence that it's false becomes not just an intellectual problem, but an existential threat to your sense of self. Your brain will fight harder to defend such identity-central beliefs. This phenomenon has profound implications for how information spreads through society. When fact-checkers attempt to correct widespread misinformation, they often inadvertently strengthen it. The very act of giving the misinformation attention and then contradicting it can sometimes cause people to remember the false claim while forgetting the correction. And for people who are emotionally or ideologically invested in the false claim, the correction triggers defensive reactions that entrench the false belief even more deeply. Understanding the backfire effect should make us humble about how much our beliefs are actually grounded in evidence. Most of our belief systems were formed gradually through exposure to information filtered by our social environment, and they're protected by powerful unconscious defensive mechanisms. We're much less rational than we like to believe, and much more susceptible to cognitive biases that operate without our awareness or consent. 5. Social facilitation and inhibition. Why you perform differently in front of others. Your performance changes dramatically depending on whether others are watching, and this happens unconsciously. A guitarist might nail a difficult riff during practice, but fumble it during a performance. A student might understand material perfectly while studying alone, but blank out during an exam. This phenomenon, called social facilitation and inhibition, explains how the presence of others affects performance in ways you can't consciously control. The basic mechanism operates through increased arousal. When others are watching, your sympathetic nervous system activates, increasing your heart rate, releasing stress hormones, and heightening your cognitive arousal. This increased arousal enhances performance on tasks you've mastered. Familiar, automatic behaviors become more energetic and efficient, but it impairs performance on novel or complex tasks. The extra arousal creates interference, causing you to second-guess yourself and make mistakes you wouldn't make alone. This is why musicians practice extensively before performances. The goal isn't just to learn the music, but to make it so automatic that increased arousal will enhance rather than impair it. An expert violinist with thousands of hours of practice has the pieces so deeply ingrained that the social facilitation effect actually improves their performance. But someone performing the same piece with only a few weeks of practice will experience social inhibition. The arousal will cause them to make mistakes they wouldn't make in private. The same principle applies to academic performance. When you're deeply familiar with material, discussing it in front of others actually helps you perform better. The extra arousal energizes your responses. But when you're uncertain about material, being called on in class to answer questions causes that uncertainty to crystallize into errors. Your brain knows the material is shaky. The presence of observers increases arousal, and the combination produces performance inhibition. Social facilitation and inhibition also operate in everyday social situations. You're more likely to dominate a conversation about a topic you know when there are several people listening. But if the conversation turns to a topic you're uncertain about, you'll unconsciously become quieter and more hesitant. The same neurological mechanism, arousal enhancement of dominant responses, explains both phenomena. This principle has profound implications for learning environments. Novice students who are asked to perform or present material they're just beginning to learn often perform poorly, not because they haven't learned, but because their learning isn't yet automatic enough to benefit from social facilitation. The conscious, effortful processing required for new material conflicts with the increased arousal from having an audience. Teachers who understand this phenomenon will create safe, low-stakes environments for initial learning, gradually increasing the social pressure only after material becomes more automatic. 6. The curse of knowledge. Why you can't remember not knowing things. Once you know something, you become fundamentally unable to simulate what it was like not to know it. This cognitive bias, called the curse of knowledge, causes experts to struggle with teaching, parents to become frustrated with children, and technology designers to create interfaces that make sense to them but baffle users. The curse of knowledge operates so unconsciously that you literally cannot access what it felt like to be ignorant. An expert chess player cannot explain how they instantly recognize that a particular board position is winning. They process the board differently than a novice, perceiving patterns rather than individual pieces. When asked to teach chess, the expert often becomes frustrated because the novice asks questions that seem obvious. But those questions aren't obvious, they only seem that way because the expert's brain has reorganized around chess knowledge, making the novice's perspective literally inaccessible to consciousness. Parents experience this constantly. A child asks why the sky is blue, and the parent struggles to explain it in age-appropriate terms because the parent has forgotten the conceptual confusion that initially characterized their understanding. The explanation that seems simple to an adult, light scatters, is incomprehensible to a child who doesn't yet grasp the concepts of light, scattering, or wavelength. The parent can't access what it felt like to not understand these things. The curse of knowledge explains why technology products often have user interfaces that are baffling to newcomers. The designers who have intimate knowledge of how the product works make decisions that make sense from their perspective, but are completely counterintuitive to people using the product for the first time. They unconsciously design for people who know what they're doing, while being unable to imagine the perspective of someone encountering the interface fresh. This curse also operates in writing and communication. When you're deeply familiar with a topic, your writing often assumes background knowledge that your readers don't have. You skip steps that seem obvious to you, but that are actually crucial for understanding. You use jargon that makes sense within your field, but is incomprehensible to outsiders. The curse of knowledge makes it nearly impossible to remember what it feels like to be confused by material that now seems simple. Understanding the curse of knowledge is valuable for anyone who teaches, designs products, or communicates complex ideas. It requires conscious effort and often feedback from novices to understand what isn't obvious to people encountering material for the first time. The curse is so powerful that you cannot simply decide to remember not knowing. You have to actively seek feedback from people who don't know and then trust their confusion even when it feels alien and incomprehensible. 7. Framing effects. Why the same choice looks different depending on how it's presented. The exact same choice will produce dramatically different decisions depending on how the options are framed. In one of the classic studies demonstrating this, participants were given 2 options for handling a disease that would kill 600 people. The first option presented the choice in terms of lives saved. Option A will save 200 lives for certain. Option B has a 1/3 probability of saving all 600 lives and a 2/3 probability of saving no one. The second option presented the identical choice in terms of lives lost. Option A will result in 400 deaths for certain. Option B has a 1/3 probability of 0 deaths and a 2/3 probability of 600 deaths. When the choice was framed in terms of lives saved, people preferred the certain option saving 200 lives guaranteed. When the identical choice was framed in terms of lives lost, people preferred the risky option, gambling for all or nothing outcomes. The mathematics were identical. Only the frame changed. Yet participants made different choices based entirely on how the information was presented. Framing effects operate through a mechanism called loss aversion. Your brain processes losses more powerfully than gains. The prospect of losing 400 lives feels worse than the prospect of saving 200, even though mathematically they're the same thing. When options are framed in terms of gains, you tend to be risk-averse, preferring sure things. When options are framed in terms of losses, you tend to be risk-seeking, willing to gamble, because the alternative feels like certain loss. Marketing and advertising exploit framing effects constantly. A yogurt labeled 95 fat-free seems more appealing than one labeled 5 fat, even though they're identical. A news story framed as "the economy grew" creates a different perception than one framed as "the economy failed to meet expectations of 3 growth." Whether medical information is presented as a 90 survival rate versus a 10 mortality rate dramatically affects how people perceive risk and make treatment decisions. Framing effects also influence how you perceive yourself and others. When someone's behavior is framed as evidence of their personality, you assume it reflects stable character traits. When the same behavior is framed as a response to the situation, you attribute it to circumstances. The behavior is identical. The frame changes everything about how you interpret its meaning. Political and social movements exploit framing effects strategically. Abortion advocates frame the issue as choice and bodily autonomy, while opponents frame it as life and protecting the unborn. Neither frame is objectively correct. They're different ways of directing attention to different morally relevant aspects of the situation. But which frame you encounter first and most frequently powerfully shapes your perspective on the issue. Your brain doesn't objectively evaluate the situation. It interprets it through the frame provided by language and context. 8. The spotlight effect. Why you overestimate how much people notice you. You feel like the spotlight is constantly on you. When you walk into a room, you feel like everyone is noticing that you're wearing an unfamiliar outfit. When you make a mistake during a presentation, you feel like the entire audience saw it and will remember it. This perception is usually wildly exaggerated. This phenomenon, called the spotlight effect, causes you to dramatically overestimate how much others notice about you. In studies demonstrating this effect, participants were asked to wear embarrassing t-shirts with a cartoon character on them to a college class. Before entering, they were asked to estimate what percentage of classmates would notice the shirt. On average, they estimated about 46. When the researchers actually surveyed the classmates, only about 25 had noticed the shirt at all. The participants were nearly twice as likely to notice themselves as others were to notice them. The spotlight effect operates because of perspective-taking failure. From your perspective, you're at the center of your attention. Your embarrassing mistake, your new haircut, your anxiety are all front and center in your conscious awareness. You unconsciously assume that what's so obvious to you is equally obvious to others. But others aren't paying nearly as much attention to you as you think. They're wrapped up in their own concerns, their own insecurities, their own spotlight effect experience. This bias affects how you present yourself in social situations. You might avoid going to an event because you're self-conscious about something, not realizing that almost nobody will notice the thing you're self-conscious about. People won't remember the awkward thing you said because they weren't paying that much attention. They weren't judging you as harshly as you were judging yourself. The spotlight effect is actually an adaptive bias in some ways. It motivates you to care about how you present yourself, which has social value. But it often functions as a source of unnecessary anxiety and social avoidance. You miss social experiences and take fewer social risks because of an exaggerated sense of how much you're being scrutinized. Understanding the spotlight effect should make you braver in social situations. When you're anxious about social judgment, remember that others are much less focused on you than you fear. They're too busy managing their own spotlight effect anxiety to be carefully evaluating your every move. 9. Mere exposure. Affect why you like things more. The more you see them, you like song more the more you hear it, even if you didn't like it initially. You prefer images of faces you've seen before to new faces, even when the faces are identical. You form preferences for random objects based simply on how many times you've encountered them. This phenomenon, called the mere exposure effect, demonstrates that familiarity breeds liking at an unconscious level. The mere exposure effect was first systematically studied by psychologist Robert Zajonc, who showed participants nonsense syllables with different frequencies. Participants had never encountered these syllables before, so any preference couldn't be based on previous associations or meaning. Yet, participants reliably preferred the syllables they'd seen more frequently. The more often you see something, the more your brain treats it as safe and familiar, and this sense of safety translates into liking. This effect explains why songs on the radio become hits, even if they don't seem particularly good. Repeated exposure creates familiarity, which creates liking. By the 100th time you hear a song, your brain has formed neural pathways associated with that song. It no longer activates surprise or novelty detection, and this reduced neural friction gets interpreted as appreciation. The mere exposure effect also operates in social relationships. People who live near each other tend to form friendships, not necessarily because they have profound connections, but simply because repeated exposure creates familiarity and liking. In office environments, people in nearby cubicles or on nearby floors form friendships more frequently than people who are equally qualified and compatible, but farther away. The difference is proximity, and therefore repeated exposure. This effect has important implications for marketing and politics. Products advertised more frequently become more popular, not necessarily because they're better, but because familiarity breeds preference. Political candidates who get more media exposure gain advantages not just from the content of the coverage, but from the mere exposure effect. Seeing their face repeatedly makes voters feel more familiar with them and therefore like them more. The mere exposure effect also explains why you feel weird returning to hometowns you left years ago. The familiar environment that once felt like home now feels slightly alien because the neural patterns associated with it are no longer constantly reinforced. But after spending a few days there, the exposure effect kicks back in and familiar places start feeling comfortable again. 10. Operational stress. Why you wear yourself down without realizing it. Your body is constantly responding to stress even when you're not consciously aware of feeling stressed. Cortisol levels spike before you open your email in the morning because your brain has learned to associate that activity with stress. Your muscles tense before you know it, consuming energy and resources. This continuous low-level stress response, called operational stress, wears away at your health and well-being without you necessarily noticing it happening. Your stress response system was designed for acute threats, the sudden appearance of a predator that required immediate fight-or-flight action. In the modern world, this system is constantly activated by chronic, low-level stressors like work deadlines, relationship tensions, financial worries, and social media notifications. Your body responds to these modern stressors with the same ancient physiological response it would use to respond to a predator: increased heart rate, elevated blood pressure, cortisol and adrenaline release, and suppression of immune and digestive functions. This stress response saved your ancestors' lives when facing physical threats, but it's maladaptive when activated chronically by psychological stressors. When your stress response activates briefly for an actual danger and then turns off, you recover quickly. But when it's activated continuously by abstract, never-ending worries and responsibilities, your body never fully recovers. You exist in a state of persistent activation that slowly damages your health through multiple pathways. Chronic stress impairs immune function, making you more susceptible to infections and disease. It promotes inflammation throughout your body, accelerating aging and increasing disease risk. It impairs sleep quality, which further weakens immunity and cognitive function. It impairs memory and learning, specifically damaging the hippocampus, the brain region crucial for forming new memories. It narrows your focus and perspective, making you less creative and more likely to engage in rigid, habitual thinking. What makes operational stress particularly insidious is that you often don't consciously feel stressed. You're habituated to your own stress response. Your elevated cortisol levels feel normal because they're your baseline. You don't notice your muscles are tense because the tension has been present so long. Meanwhile, your body is silently accumulating damage. Addressing operational stress requires becoming aware of your baseline stress response and then deliberately cultivating activities that lower it. Exercise, meditation, time in nature, social connection, and adequate sleep all activate your parasympathetic nervous system, turning off the stress response and allowing recovery. But many people don't engage in these activities not because they lack time, but because their stressed brains have poor access to motivation and pleasure systems. 11. The illusion of transparency. Why you overestimate how well others understand you. You feel like your thoughts, feelings, and intentions are obvious to the people around you. When you're annoyed, you assume they can see it. When you like someone, you assume it's transparent. When you're secretly judging someone, you feel like they know. This feeling of transparency, that your internal state is obvious to others, is largely an illusion. The illusion of transparency causes you to dramatically overestimate how well others understand what you're really thinking and feeling. In studies demonstrating this effect, participants were asked to listen to a story and then figure out whether they believed it or not. Other participants watching the listeners were asked to guess whether the listener believed the story. The listeners consistently overestimated how obvious their belief was to observers. They felt like their skepticism or acceptance was visible and transparent, but observers were only moderately accurate in guessing their reactions. The listeners' internal states felt obvious from the inside, but weren't nearly as obvious from the outside. The illusion of transparency occurs because you have access to the internal experience others don't have. You know how you feel, what you're thinking, why you're reacting a certain way. This rich internal information creates a sense that your inner world is accessible to others, but they only see your external behavior, your facial expressions, your words, your actions. And external behavior is often ambiguous and can be interpreted in multiple ways. This illusion has profound implications for relationships and communication. You might think your hurt is obvious to your partner and feel resentful that they aren't responding to it, not realizing that your hurt isn't as obvious to them as it is to you. They're not being insensitive. They genuinely didn't notice. You might think your romantic interest is transparent to someone you like, not realizing that they're interpreting your behavior in completely different ways. The ambiguity of external behavior means you can't reliably communicate your internal states without explicitly stating them. The illusion of transparency also affects how you communicate humor, a joke that's hilarious in your head because you understand the context, and the intention might fall flat when spoken aloud, because the listener doesn't have access to the rich internal context that makes it funny. Many awkward social moments result from the speaker overestimating how transparent their intention and humor are to their audience. In professional and political contexts, the illusion of transparency causes miscommunication and conflict. A manager might think their decision is obviously the right one and become frustrated with employees who question it, not realizing that the reasoning that seems transparent from inside the decision-making process isn't obvious to outsiders. Politicians struggle to communicate their intentions to the public because what seems like an obvious and sensible policy to them often seems alien and suspect to people without access to the internal reasoning. 12. Temporal discounting. Why you prioritize now over later without realizing it. You would rather have $1 today than $2 tomorrow. You would rather feel good right now than take an action that would make you feel better tomorrow. You would rather watch television now than do the exercise that would make you healthier. This systematic preference for immediate rewards over delayed rewards, called temporal discounting, explains much of your self-defeating behavior and operates largely outside conscious awareness. Your brain has evolved to value immediate rewards much more than delayed rewards. This made perfect evolutionary sense in an environment where survival was uncertain. A benefit obtained today was worth far more than a benefit that might never arrive. But in the modern world, where delayed rewards are often more valuable than immediate rewards, this ancient preference becomes self-destructive. The degree of temporal discounting varies across individuals. Some people discount the future much more steeply than others. Someone with steep temporal discounting will choose a small immediate reward even when a much larger delayed reward is available. Someone with gentler temporal discounting will be willing to wait for the larger reward. This individual variation explains much of the difference in financial success, health outcomes, and life satisfaction between people. Temporal discounting operates through multiple neural systems. The limbic system, particularly the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, assigns high value to immediate rewards. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, associated with rational planning and impulse control, tends to assign more balanced value to delayed rewards. When you're tired, stressed, or otherwise depleted, the emotional limbic system has more influence over behavior. When you're well-rested and cognitively resourced, the rational planning system has more influence. This is why self-control is hard when you're tired. When you've been making decisions all day, your prefrontal cortex becomes fatigued and less able to counteract the limbic system's preference for immediate reward. The brain actually uses more glucose when exerting self-control, and when glucose is depleted, your capacity for delaying gratification collapses. This is why people make their worst food choices late in the evening. Their impulse control is compromised by decision fatigue and glucose depletion. Understanding temporal discounting can help you structure your environment to counteract it. You can't eliminate the temporal discounting bias, but you can make immediate rewards less available and make delayed rewards more salient. Putting unhealthy food at the back of the pantry and healthy food in front creates friction that leverages your temporal discounting bias toward choosing the healthy option. Setting up automatic transfers to savings accounts makes the delayed reward of savings feel more immediate and certain. 13. The halo effect. Why one trait colors your perception of everything else. If someone is physically attractive, you unconsciously assume they're also intelligent, kind, competent, and trustworthy. If someone is successful in one area, you assume they're successful in other unrelated areas. If someone has one good trait, that trait casts a positive light on all their other traits, even if those traits are unrelated. This phenomenon, called the halo effect, causes you to form overall impressions based on limited information and then interpret all subsequent information through the lens of that initial impression. The halo effect is so powerful that it affects even high-stakes decisions with severe consequences. In studies of legal proceedings, physically attractive defendants receive lighter sentences than unattractive defendants for the same crimes. In hiring situations, attractive candidates are rated as more competent and intelligent, even when their qualifications are identical to less attractive candidates. In education, teachers rate attractive children as more intelligent than unattractive children, leading to different treatment and expectations that actually create differences in performance. The halo effect operates through a shortcut your brain uses to process overwhelming information. When faced with limited information about a person, your brain needs to make rapid judgments, rather than suspending judgment until all relevant information is available. Your brain takes one prominent feature, physical attractiveness, success, charisma, and uses it to fill in information about less obvious features. This works well enough in many contexts, but it creates systematic errors when one prominent feature is unrelated to other important features. The halo effect also operates in brand perception and marketing. When you like a brand or celebrity, you're more likely to perceive their other products and ventures positively, even if they're unrelated to what made you like them initially. A celebrity known for athletic ability gains credibility regarding car brands or beverages, even though athletic ability tells us nothing about the quality of those products. But the halo effect means we unconsciously assume that if they're good at sports, they probably have good taste in cars. The halo effect works in reverse as well, in what's called the horn effect or devil effect. If someone has one negative trait, that trait can cast negative light on their other traits. A politician who is caught in one scandal might have all their previous accomplishments and policies reinterpreted through a negative lens. An employee who makes one major mistake might be assumed to be generally incompetent, even if they have an otherwise strong track record. Understanding the halo effect should make you skeptical of your first impressions and your tendency to assume competence across domains. Someone who is charismatic and articulate isn't necessarily intelligent or trustworthy. Someone who is successful in one area isn't automatically successful in other areas. Your initial impressions are fast and useful, but often wrong. Postponing judgment until you have relevant information in multiple domains is difficult, because the halo effect operates unconsciously, but awareness of the bias at least gives you a chance to counteract it. 14. Loss aversion. Why losing 20 hurts more than finding 20 feels good. If you found 20 on the street, it would make you happy. But if you lost 20, the sadness would be more intense and longer lasting than the happiness from finding it. This is loss aversion, the tendency for losses to feel roughly twice as powerful as equivalent gains. This asymmetry is not a conscious choice. It's a built-in feature of how your brain's reward and pain systems operate. Loss aversion served an important evolutionary function. An organism that valued avoiding loss equally to pursuing gain would be relatively indifferent to being robbed as long as it could pursue something of equal value elsewhere. But an organism that was much more sensitive to loss would fight harder to avoid being robbed and would be much less likely to gamble with resources necessary for survival. Loss aversion made your ancestors more cautious and more likely to preserve what they had, rather than risk it for potential gains. But in the modern world, loss aversion often causes suboptimal decisions. Investors hold on to losing stock because the pain of realizing losses is intense, even when the rational choice is to cut losses and invest in better opportunities. People stay in unhappy situations because the loss involved in leaving feels worse than the pain of staying. Insurance companies exploit loss aversion by selling people insurance against unlikely events, knowing that the pain of potentially losing money to a disaster outweighs the rational probability of that disaster occurring. Loss aversion also affects how you perceive ownership. Once you own something, your brain starts to value it more highly than it did before you owned it. This phenomenon, called the endowment effect, means that people asking you to sell something you own will typically receive much less than people would be willing to pay to acquire the identical item. You're not consciously deciding to value it more. The neural systems that assign value actually treat owned items differently than unowned items. Loss aversion interacts with status quo bias, the tendency to prefer things to remain the way they are. Combined, these biases create a strong tendency toward inaction and preservation of the current state. Changing from the status quo involves the loss of the current state, and loss aversion makes people exaggerate how bad change might be. Understanding loss aversion should help you make better decisions by consciously counteracting it. When facing a decision, try to deliberately weigh gains and losses equally rather than allowing losses to loom so large. Try to think about opportunities rather than threats, reframing situations in terms of what you might gain rather than what you might lose can help overcome loss aversion's distorting effects on judgment. 15. Priming and automatic associations. Why subtle cues change your thoughts and behavior. Words you just read influence your behavior for minutes afterward without you realizing it. If you just read words related to aging, elderly, retirement, gray, you walk more slowly when leaving the experiment. If you just read words related to achievement, strive, compete, succeed, you perform better on subsequent tasks. If you just read words related to a particular race, you become more likely to perceive ambiguous behavior as hostile. These effects of priming demonstrate that your thoughts and behavior are constantly being influenced by subtle environmental cues you're not consciously processing. Priming operates through automatic activation of concepts and their associated meanings. Your brain is organized in networks where related concepts activate each other. Once one concept is activated by reading a word, seeing an image, hearing a sound, it remains partially activated for a period, making related concepts easier to access. This activation influences what you think about and how you interpret ambiguous information. The most famous demonstration of priming comes from studies where participants unconsciously processed words related to rudeness, politeness, or neutral concepts, and then had to interrupt an experimenter to leave the room. Participants primed with rudeness interrupted significantly faster. Those primed with politeness took longer and were more apologetic. No one consciously thought, "I was just primed with rude words, so I should be rude." The priming influenced their automatic behavior without their awareness. Priming also influences how you interpret social situations. If you're primed with concepts related to suspicion and betrayal, you interpret ambiguous social behavior as hostile. If you're primed with concepts related to helpfulness and cooperation, you interpret the same ambiguous behavior as friendly. The objective behavior hasn't changed. Only your primed conceptual framework has changed, and this changes your interpretation. Companies exploit priming constantly through advertising and product placement. Seeing images of athletes makes you associate exercise and health with the brand. Hearing upbeat music makes you associate positivity with the product. These aren't rational persuasion arguments, they're subtle influence on your automatic associations. After being exposed to certain priming, you develop vague positive feelings toward brands, and these feelings unconsciously influence your purchasing decisions. Priming can even influence your self-concept and your behavior. If you're primed with concepts related to intelligence, you subsequently perform better on intellectual tasks, not because you became more intelligent, but because the activated concepts increased your motivation and changed your self-perception temporarily. Priming can cause temporary stereotype threat, where priming with concepts related to a negative stereotype associated with your group actually impairs your performance on tasks relevant to that stereotype. 16. Habituation. Why you stop noticing what's constant. The background hum of your refrigerator is constantly reaching your ears, but you stopped noticing it hours ago. The feeling of your clothes against your skin is constantly reaching your somatosensory cortex, but you're not aware of it unless you shift attention. Your brain has a built-in system for tuning out constant, unchanging stimuli so that you can focus on novel information and changes. This process, called habituation, operates completely outside your awareness. Habituation is adaptive. Your ancestors needed to notice the new rustling in the bushes, possibly a predator, much more than the constant sound of wind in the trees. Your brain developed mechanisms to filter out constant, non-threatening stimuli, so attention could be directed toward novel, potentially important information. This same mechanism still operates today. Habituation creates significant consequences for your behavior and emotions. Positive experiences that initially bring great joy, a new relationship, a new possession, a promotion, gradually become the new baseline. You habituate to the positive change, and your happiness returns to baseline. This is called the hedonic treadmill. You're constantly returning to your baseline level of well-being, despite significant life changes. Major positive changes bring temporary increases in happiness that fade as you habituate. Major negative changes bring temporary decreases that also fade. This habituation explains why lottery winners typically return to their baseline happiness level within a year or two, despite permanently increased income. It explains why students are excited about college for the first few weeks, but then habituate to it, and their baseline happiness returns to where it was before college. It explains why the first kiss with a new romantic partner is thrilling, but eventually becomes routine as you habituate to it. Understanding habituation should influence how you seek happiness and meaning. Since positive changes produce temporary boosts that fade due to habituation, constantly seeking new positive experiences is ultimately futile. But behaviors that are novel or variable don't produce habituation as quickly. Spending time in nature produces more lasting happiness than buying possessions because natural environments change constantly and therefore produce less complete habituation. Experiences produce more lasting satisfaction than possessions. For the same reason, experiences vary in ways possessions don't. Relationships also benefit from understanding habituation. The initial intense attraction and passion fades not because the relationship is failing, but because both partners habituate to each other. Couples who maintain novelty in their relationships, who are willing to do new things together, who maintain some mystery about each other, show stronger long-term satisfaction precisely because they're not fully habituating to each other. 17. The availability. Bias in emotional reasoning. Why you trust your feelings as data. And if something comes easily to mind because you recently thought about it, or because it was dramatic and emotionally impactful, you assume it's more common or true than it actually is. This is the availability bias, and it combines with emotional reasoning, the belief that if you feel something strongly, it must be true, to create systematic errors in judgment. After hearing a news story about a plane crash, you overestimate how often plane crashes occur and might change your travel plans, despite the statistics showing that flying is extremely safe. Your anxiety about flying feels like data about the danger of flying, but it's actually just anxiety. It doesn't accurately reflect the actual risk. But the feeling is so immediate and visceral that you treat it as evidence. Emotional reasoning causes people to stick with beliefs precisely because they feel strongly about them. If you feel strongly that someone is untrustworthy, that feeling becomes evidence in your mind that they are untrustworthy, even if the evidence doesn't support this conclusion. If you feel strongly that a particular political candidate is dishonest, you interpret every action through that lens and treat your feeling as confirmation of the candidate's dishonesty. The power of emotional reasoning is particularly evident in anxiety and depression. Someone with anxiety might feel like a plane is about to crash and treat this feeling as evidence that a crash is likely to occur, despite knowing the actual statistics. Someone with depression might feel worthless and treat this feeling as evidence that they actually are worthless, despite evidence to the contrary. The feeling is so immediate and compelling that it overwhelms rational thought. Emotional reasoning also underlies magical thinking and superstition. If you feel like something bad is about to happen, that feeling seems like evidence of genuine danger, even though it's just a feeling. If you feel like wearing particular clothing will bring good luck, that feeling seems like evidence that the clothing actually does have this effect, even though the causal connection is non-existent. The feeling is treated as data. Understanding emotional reasoning should help you question your feelings when they seem to contradict the objective evidence. Your feelings are data about your internal state, not necessarily data about the external reality. Anxiety tells you that you're anxious, not that you're in danger. A strong conviction tells you that you're convinced, not that something is true. This distinction seems obvious intellectually, but emotionally, feelings feel like facts. 18. Social comparison and relative deprivation. Why your satisfaction depends on what others have. Your satisfaction with your salary, your home, your appearance, and your life accomplishments depends not on the absolute level, but on how they compare to the people around you. If everyone you know earns $100,000 and has a house in a particular neighborhood, you feel satisfied earning $100,000 and living in that neighborhood. But if you move to a wealthier neighborhood where everyone earns $200,000, you might feel poor despite earning the same amount. This phenomenon, called relative deprivation, means that your subjective well-being is largely determined by social comparison rather than absolute circumstances. Relative deprivation explains why increases in income above a certain threshold produce minimal increases in happiness. Once you have enough money to meet basic needs and some discretionary spending, additional income produces minimal increases in subjective well-being. This isn't because you're not conscious of the additional money, it's because your reference group, the people you compare yourself to, also has more money. You're on the same hedonic treadmill together. Social media massively amplifies social comparison effects by constantly providing you with information about what others are doing, accomplishing, and acquiring. You see carefully curated highlight reels of others' lives and compare them to your internal experience, your struggles, doubts, mundane moments. This lopsided comparison makes you feel like others are having more exciting, successful, and satisfying lives than you are. Social comparison also influences what you aspire to. If the people in your reference group aspire to particular things, you develop similar aspirations. If everyone at your school goes to prestigious universities, you develop aspirations for a prestigious university. If everyone in your social group has become financially successful, you develop financial success as an aspiration. These aren't your authentic aspirations. They're developed through social comparison and cultural transmission. Social comparison also underlies much of status-seeking behavior. You acquire possessions and accomplishments not necessarily because they provide intrinsic satisfaction, but because they signal status relative to others. A luxury car provides little practical advantage over a standard car, but signals wealth and status relative to people driving standard cars. Status-seeking behavior is often unconscious. You're not consciously thinking, "I want to signal high status to others." You're just drawn to the luxury item because it seems desirable. Understanding relative deprivation should make you more conscious of your reference group and more intentional about social comparison. You can deliberately choose who you compare yourself to and what domains you compare yourself on. If you compare your success to people more successful than you, you feel unsuccessful. If you compare your appearance to celebrities with professional makeup and lighting and digital enhancement, you feel unattractive. But if you choose comparison groups more deliberately, you can influence how satisfied you feel with your life. 19. Anchoring and arbitrary. Coherence. Why your preferences are influenced by random numbers. You're walking past a store and see a sweater on sale for $40, marked down from $150. It seems like a great deal, so you buy it. But the original price of $150 was probably arbitrary. It was never the actual price. The retailer established a high anchor price, then discounted to the attractive sale price, and your brain treats the anchor as meaningful information about the sweater's value even though it was arbitrary. Anchoring affects how you value things through a process called arbitrary coherence. Your brain encounters an initial number, anchor, and treats it as meaningful information. You then unconsciously adjust from that anchor to form your judgment. You don't adjust far enough because the adjustment process is insufficient, leaving you biased toward the initial anchor. This occurs even when you know the anchor is arbitrary. Studies show that When people are asked to guess the percentage of African nations in the United Nations, their guesses are significantly higher after spinning a wheel and randomly landing on a high number. The randomly generated number serves as an anchor that influences their subsequent judgment. When the anchor is low, their guesses are lower. The participants know the random number has nothing to do with the actual percentage, yet the anchor still influences their thinking. Salespeople exploit anchoring constantly by presenting high initial prices. Once the customer's mind is anchored to the high price, the negotiated lower price seems reasonable, even if the negotiated price was the intended price all along. Similarly, real estate agents understand anchoring and present properties with high opening prices, as this anchors buyers' perceptions of value. Anchoring also influences negotiations. In salary negotiations, the first person to propose a number substantially influences the final negotiated salary. The higher the initial anchor, the higher the final negotiated salary, even among sophisticated negotiators who understand anchoring. The effect is powerful enough that salary negotiations often hinge on who goes first and what number they propose. Anchoring affects beliefs as well as purchasing decisions. Initial information about a candidate or issue serves as an anchor that influences your subsequent judgments. Once you've heard a particular narrative about something, alternative narratives seem less credible because you've already anchored to the first narrative. This is why the order of information presentation matters so much in courtrooms, political debates, and marketing. 20. Decision fatigue. Why your judgments deteriorate as you make more decisions. After a long day of making decisions, your judgment becomes worse. Your ability to resist temptation decreases, your self-control weakens, your capacity to maintain focus diminishes. This degradation in decision-making quality as a function of the number of prior decisions is called decision fatigue, and it operates through actual depletion of neurological resources. Decision-making requires glucose in the brain and activity in the prefrontal cortex. With each decision you make, your glucose levels drop and your prefrontal cortex becomes fatigued. This is why your worst food decisions often come late in the evening. Your prefrontal cortex has been depleted by the decision-making throughout the day and is less able to override your limbic system's preference for immediate gratification. Decision fatigue explains why successful people often wear the same clothes repeatedly. Steve Jobs famously wore essentially the same outfit every day. Mark Zuckerberg wears the same gray shirt. These aren't eccentric habits. They're strategies to preserve decision-making capacity for important decisions. By eliminating trivial decisions like what to wear, they preserve their depleted glucose and prefrontal cortex, resources for decisions that matter. Decision fatigue also affects important life decisions made late in the day or after many prior decisions. Court judges make harsher decisions as the day progresses, with parole decisions becoming significantly harsher just before lunch or after work has been particularly busy. Medical diagnoses made late in shifts have higher error rates than diagnoses made earlier. Important career decisions made after a day of meetings are more likely to be regretted than important career decisions made with a fresh mind. Understanding decision fatigue suggests that you should make important decisions when your decision-making capacity is freshest, typically in the morning or after periods of rest and food. You should reduce the number of trivial decisions you make so that you have more capacity for important decisions. You should be aware that your judgment becomes less reliable as you become more fatigued, making you more vulnerable to manipulation and more likely to make decisions you'll regret. Decision fatigue also explains why willpower is limited. Self-control is a decision to override your automatic impulses. Each instance of self-control draws on the same depleted resources as decision-making. After making difficult decisions or exerting self-control, you have less capacity for further self-control. This is why people often engage in destructive behaviors late in the evening. They've depleted their self-control through the day and no longer have the resources to resist temptation. 21. Outgroup homogeneity. Bias. Why people outside your group seem similar to each other. You perceive people in your group, your nationality, religion, profession, sports team fandom as diverse individuals with distinct personalities and traits. But you perceive people in an outgroup as more similar to each other, more interchangeable, more defined by their group membership. This is called outgroup homogeneity bias, and it causes you to see diversity within your group and uniformity in other groups. This bias operates partly through reduced exposure and familiarity. You know many individual members of your in-group in varied contexts, revealing their individuality. You encounter outgroup members more rarely and often in limited contexts that don't reveal their individuality. The stereotypes you know about the outgroup serve as a template for understanding all outgroup members you encounter, making them seem more uniform than they actually are. Outgroup homogeneity bias also operates through different levels of cognitive processing. You process information about in-group members at a more detailed individuating level. You process information about outgroup members at a more categorical level using stereotypes and group-level information. This different processing leads to perceived differences in diversity, even though the actual diversity is probably similar. Outgroup homogeneity bias contributes significantly to prejudice and discrimination. When you perceive an outgroup as homogeneous, stereotypes about the group seem more applicable to any individual member. You see a member of a different race and unconsciously process them through stereotypes about that race more than you'd process a member of your own race through racial stereotypes. You're not consciously thinking all members of that group are X. It's more that your automatic processing treats group membership as more informative about individuals in outgroups than individuals in in-groups. This bias also makes prejudice more likely to persist. When an outgroup member violates a stereotype when you meet a kind, intelligent member of a group, you hold negative stereotypes about your brain often doesn't update the stereotype. Instead, it assigns the individual to a subtype of the group, leaving the broader stereotype unchanged. One kind, intelligent member doesn't change your perception of the group as a whole because you're not processing them at the group level. You're treating them as an exception. Reducing outgroup homogeneity bias requires exposure to diverse individual members of the outgroup in contexts that allow you to see their diversity. Simply knowing facts about group diversity isn't enough. You need to have personalized contact with diverse outgroup members so that your brain can process them as individuals rather than exemplars of their group. This is why intergroup contact is so effective for reducing prejudice. It forces your brain to engage with outgroup members as individuals, revealing the diversity within the group. 22. The illusion of understanding. Why you overestimate your comprehension. You read an article about a complex topic and feel like you understand it. You listen to an explanation of a phenomenon and feel like you grasp the mechanism. This sense of understanding feels compelling. You could explain it to someone else, you think. But when you actually try to explain it, you realize your understanding is much shallower than you thought. This gap between the sense of understanding and actual understanding is called the illusion of understanding. The illusion of understanding occurs partly through a process called metacognitive error, misidentifying your familiarity with information as evidence of understanding. You recognize the words in an article about quantum mechanics, so those words feel familiar. Your brain mistakes this familiarity with actual understanding of the concepts. You have a representation of the information in memory, but that representation doesn't include the deeper mechanistic understanding, how the pieces fit together, why they work the way they do, what implications follow from them. The illusion of understanding is particularly powerful with explanations that have a compelling narrative structure. A well-told explanation can make you feel like you understand something even when the explanation glosses over important details or contains inaccuracies. Documentaries are notorious for creating the illusion of understanding. Viewers watch the documentary and feel like they now understand a complex topic, but they often have learned mainly a compelling narrative without understanding the underlying mechanisms. The illusion of understanding also occurs with conspiracy theories and pseudoscientific explanations. A conspiracy theory often provides a compelling narrative that explains various observations and creates a sense of understanding. The person believing the conspiracy theory feels like they understand what's really going on behind the official narratives. This sense of understanding is compelling precisely because it provides a coherent narrative explanation. But the understanding is often illusory based on narrative coherence rather than actual evidence or mechanistic understanding. Understanding the illusion of understanding should make you more skeptical of your sense of comprehension. When you feel like you understand something, try to actually explain it to someone else in detail. When trying to explain it, you'll discover gaps in your understanding. You'll hit points where you realize you don't actually know why something works the way it does, you just knew that it does work that way. This discovery of gaps is valuable because it reveals where your understanding is actually shallow. The illusion of understanding also has pedagogical implications. Students studying a topic can feel like they understand it because they recognize the material and can recall key facts. But when they encounter a test asking them to apply that knowledge to a new context, they discover their understanding is more superficial than they thought. This is why retrieval practice and elaboration are so important in learning. They force you to go beyond the mere familiarity that creates the illusion of understanding. 23. Fundamental attribution. Error and actor-observer. Bias. Why you misjudge others' motivation. When someone cuts you off in traffic, you immediately assume they're a terrible driver or a reckless person. When you cut someone off, you know you were distracted or didn't see them. This asymmetry in attribution, attributing others' behavior to their personality while attributing your own behavior to the situation, is called the fundamental attribution error, or actor-observer bias, and it causes you to systematically misjudge other people's motivations and character. The fundamental attribution error occurs because you have different information about yourself and others. You have access to rich context about your own situation. You know you were distracted. You know you didn't see the other car. You know you're normally a careful driver. You lack this situational context for others. You only see the behavior without the rich contextual information. In the absence of situational information, your brain defaults to assuming the behavior reflects their personality. This bias is particularly powerful in professional and social contexts. A coworker who makes a mistake is assumed to be incompetent. You making the same mistake is attributed to situational factors. You were overworked. The task was confusing. You didn't have enough information. Your boss is quick and efficient because she's an organized person. You're quick and efficient when you happen to accomplish tasks fast because of favorable circumstances. These asymmetries in attribution create distorted impressions of others' character and competence. The fundamental attribution error also underlies much of the judgment within social inequality. If someone is poor, the fundamental attribution error attributes this to personal failings. They must be lazy, unmotivated, or less intelligent. The rich situational factors starting economic situation, access to education, systemic discrimination, random bad luck are underweighted. This bias can make people blame victims for circumstances largely beyond their control. Reducing the fundamental attribution error requires deliberately considering situational factors when judging others' behavior. When someone seems to behave badly, instead of immediately attributing it to their personality, ask yourself what situational factors might explain their behavior. What might they be experiencing that you're not aware of? What pressures or constraints might they be operating under? This deliberate consideration of context can help correct the bias that otherwise operates automatically. Actor-observer bias also works in reverse for positive behavior. When you do something good, you're prone to attributing it to who you are as a person, your inherent kindness or intelligence. When others do something good, you're more likely to attribute it to the situation. They happened to be in the right place at the right time. They were trying to impress someone. They felt obligated. This reversal of bias for positive behavior means that you tend to see yourself in a more positive light than you see others, contributing to a self-serving bias. 24. Reactance. Why being told no makes you want to do something more. When you're told you can't do something, the very prohibition creates a desire to do it. This psychological phenomenon, called reactance, occurs when you perceive your freedom as being threatened or restricted. In response, you feel a motivational drive to restore that freedom by engaging in the prohibited behavior or reasserting your autonomy in some way. Reactance can be triggered by explicit prohibitions, "You can't do that," or by implicit threats to freedom. If you feel like someone is trying to control you or manipulate you, reactance can be triggered even without explicit prohibition. A parent who forbids a teenager from seeing a particular friend often inadvertently strengthens the teenager's desire to see that friend, precisely because the prohibition threatens the teenager's sense of autonomy. Reactance operates through emotional and motivational systems. When you perceive a threat to your freedom, you feel frustrated, angry, or motivated to prove your autonomy. These emotions propel you toward behavior that restores the sense of freedom. If someone forbids you from doing something, doing it reasserts your freedom and control. Even if you weren't particularly interested in the forbidden behavior before, the prohibition creates interest precisely because it allows you to assert your autonomy. Reactance is particularly strong when the threat to freedom seems unjustified or when you already value the threatened freedom. If a government tries to ban a particular book that citizens value, reactance can cause people to be much more interested in reading the book than they were before the ban. The prohibition itself creates desire that wasn't present before. Reactance also affects persuasion attempts. When someone tries too hard to persuade you to do something when you feel manipulated or pressured, reactance can cause you to move in the opposite direction, becoming more entrenched in your original position or more likely to do the opposite of what you're being persuaded to do. This is particularly true if you perceive the persuasion attempt as a threat to your autonomy. Understanding reactance can help you in persuasion and influence situations. Rather than prohibiting behavior or pressuring people toward particular choices, leaving people with a sense of autonomy and choice actually increases the likelihood they'll choose what you want them to choose. Offering options and allowing people to make free choices avoids triggering reactance. Parents who understand reactance are more likely to use permissive rather than restrictive approaches to parenting because they understand that restrictions often backfire by triggering reactance. 25. Implicit bias and unconscious. Stereotyping. Why you harbor prejudices. You don't consciously believe that people should be treated equally regardless of race, gender, or other group membership. Yet you harbor unconscious stereotypes and biases that influence your behavior in subtle ways. These implicit biases operate outside your conscious awareness, influencing your split-second reactions to people, your snap judgments about their character and abilities, your decisions about who to hire or promote. Implicit biases form through exposure to cultural stereotypes. You've been absorbing stereotypes your entire life through media, conversation, overheard comments, and countless examples that taught you associations between groups and traits. A black face becomes associated through media exposure with crime or athletic ability. A female face becomes associated with caretaking or emotional expressiveness. An Asian face becomes associated with intelligence or poor driving. These associations form automatically through exposure to cultural messages. What makes implicit biases particularly problematic is that they operate completely outside conscious control. You might be someone who consciously rejects stereotypes and genuinely believes in equality. Yet your automatic responses still harbor the stereotypes you've unconsciously absorbed. This means you're not a bad person for having implicit biases. You're a normal person in a culture that broadcasts stereotypes. Implicit biases have measurable consequences for behavior. In hiring situations, resumes with names associated with minority groups receive fewer callbacks than identical resumes with names associated with majority groups. In medical situations, doctors hold implicit biases that affect their diagnoses and treatment recommendations. In criminal justice situations, implicit biases affect jury decisions and sentencing. In education situations, teachers hold implicit biases that affect expectations and evaluations of students from different groups. What's particularly problematic about implicit biases is that they persist even after being made explicit. Being told that you harbor implicit biases doesn't automatically eliminate them. The biases are unconscious and automatic, formed through vast exposure to stereotypes, and they aren't easily updated through conscious awareness alone. Multiple exposures to counter-stereotype examples can gradually weaken implicit biases, but the process is slow and doesn't work for everyone. Understanding implicit bias should make you humble about your objectivity and fairness. Even if you consciously value equality, your automatic responses likely harbor stereotypes and biases. This doesn't make you a bad person. It makes you human, and it happens in cultures that communicate stereotypes. Acknowledging this should make you more willing to implement systems that reduce the influence of implicit bias, having diverse hiring panels, implementing standardized evaluation criteria, seeking out counter-stereotype examples to gradually weaken biases over time. You navigate your entire life through a forest of unconscious processes, psychological biases, and automatic responses that shape your behavior in ways you rarely consider. The 25 phenomena explored in this examination represent just a fraction of the psychological forces operating behind the scenes of consciousness, orchestrating behavior and influencing perception without your awareness. These processes aren't failures of human cognition, they're features, usually adaptive solutions to ancient problems that made sense in the environments where humans evolved. Your brain had to solve the problem of processing vastly more information than consciousness could handle. So it developed unconscious systems that filtered, interpreted, and responded to information automatically. Your brain had to make rapid decisions in uncertain situations, so it developed heuristics and shortcuts that usually work well enough. Your brain had to navigate complex social groups, so it developed automatic processes for social reasoning and group membership. But these same processes that made your ancestors successful often produce errors in the modern world. The biases that helped your ancestors survive by being cautious about outgroups now create prejudice. The temporal discounting that made immediate survival important now causes you to neglect long-term health. The social comparison mechanisms that helped you assess your status now cause perpetual dissatisfaction. The automatic processes are the same, but the context has changed. Understanding these unconscious processes is the first step toward change. You cannot override a process you're not aware of. By bringing these processes into consciousness, understanding how mirror neurons operate, how cognitive biases distort perception, how priming influences behavior, you gain the possibility of deliberate choice. You might not be able to eliminate these processes, but awareness gives you the chance to notice when they're operating and to deliberately counteract their distorting effects. This is profoundly humbling. It means acknowledging that your sense of rationality and objectivity is largely an illusion. You're not the conscious agent in control of your behavior that you believe yourself to be. You're not as objective or fair-minded as you think. You're not as aware of the real reasons for your behavior as you assume. But it's also liberating. It means you're not as responsible for your biases as you might feel, and it suggests that change is possible through understanding and deliberate effort. The most important insight from studying these 25 things you do without knowing why is this: your mind is not reliable. It doesn't perceive reality accurately. It doesn't process information objectively. It doesn't make decisions based purely on rational deliberation. Your mind is incredibly sophisticated, capable of extraordinary accomplishments, but it's also fundamentally limited, biased, and often wrong. This realization should inspire humility and curiosity. Humility about your own understanding and judgment, curiosity about the actual mechanisms operating in your brain and influencing your behavior. With that humility and curiosity comes the possibility of living more wisely, making better decisions, and treating others more fairly. You may never escape the unconscious processes that drive your behavior, but understanding them might just make you a bit less of a slave to them.